um, helping them out with some things, and the Nellie Bly is running around somewhere, so you may see a cat fly across the background. Don't pay any mind to her. I hope you're all well and happy and safe and had a good week. This week I read a book. Oh, wait, question of the week. Question of the week is, how many indigenous tribes can you name? And if it's one or two and they're all from Westerns, I challenge you this week to learn the names of at least 10 Native American indigenous tribes from North America. So that's my question of the week. That's my challenge for you. I read this book this week. It's Recovering the Sacred by Winona LaDuke. And it was written during the Bush administration, Bush Jr. administration. So it's a little bit out of date in terms of, she talks about a lot of cases that have now changed or have, she didn't know the outcome at that point, and now we know the outcome. So I stopped a lot and did a lot of Googling to figure out kind of where things were sitting at that point in time versus this point in time. And it's very, very, it's a great book, first of all. I highly recommend it. Winona LaDuke lives, or at least at the time of this book, lived on a reservation up in Minnesota. And so the question of the week is actually from this book. She asks, when she does public speaking engagements, she asks how many tribes folks can name. And usually it's not very many. So lots to talk about with Indigenous rights. So much. There's way too much to talk about. So I thought I would focus on something that has been very recently in the news, which is Indigenous land rights. There was actually a Supreme Court case that was decided just last month on July 9th, and it was McGirt v. Oklahoma. There was a precedent to this that was Sharp v. Murphy. So the general gist here is that folks in Oklahoma were appealing their prison sentences under the precedent, or under the idea that most of eastern Oklahoma is actually still tribal land. So there were 5 big tribes in eastern Oklahoma at the turn of the 20th century, so 1900, and that was the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, Muskogee, Seminole, and Cherokee tribes. So those big 5. There was, at the beginning of the century, there was a congressional either treaty or decision that said that those lands were tribal lands, and they were actually never dissolved. So these cases that have been coming up the past 2 years are arguing that Native folks who commit crimes in these 5 tribal lands should be tried by tribal courts instead of the U.S. courts. So the first time this came up was not the first time, but the first time it reached SCOTUS was in Sharp v. Murphy in 2019, and they were actually deadlocked on it because Neil Gorsuch, and I did look up how to pronounce his name, and there's a video of him saying it, so that is how you say it, Gorsuch. He actually served on the 10th Circuit Court that heard the case, and so he recused himself prior to SCOTUS hearing the case. So he recused himself from all the arguments and all the hearings, and they were totally deadlocked, 4-4. And they were going to rehear it in 2020, but instead they ended up hearing and deciding on McGirt v. Oklahoma. And Gorsuch, it was believed that he would be the swing vote, and he was. The decision was 5-4, and they ruled last month that eastern Oklahoma, those 5 tribes still have sovereignty there. So this is really fascinating because it includes the city of Tulsa, it includes the city of Broken Bow, and it has all kinds of ramifications for sovereignty and for tribal lands. But overall, it's seen as a really, really big win for indigenous populations, especially in the United States, because and Gorsuch wrote this in the opinion. He said it's the government, it's holding the government to its word. So which is a rare case of that, especially in terms of relations to Native Americans. We have, since European settlers got here, we've consistently taken their land in the name of settling, and in the name more recently of oil and gold and other commodities that we claim to have a right to, even if they're on tribal lands. So this is a pretty huge case. I actually didn't hear anything about it last month when it was decided, so I don't think it has splashed that many mainstream headlines, but it's a really, really big deal. And another thing that the case did uphold was that only Congress can disestablish tribal lands. So this was actually the result of a Supreme Court case in 1903, which was Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, which said that Congress does have the right to disestablish tribal lands, which is very, very strange if you think about it, because they don't have any right to the land in the first place. So how can they disestablish it if they never established it? But it did establish that Congress can disestablish tribal lands. So this weird colonial law from the turn of the century does still exist. Congress could say that these 5 nations have no right to their land. That's unlikely with a split Congress, but who knows? So one of the interesting things about this is what it affects now versus what it affects going forward. At the end of last year, 2019, Oklahoma said they had 1,887 incarcerated Native Americans, and most of these folks will not be able to appeal their decision. About 10% of them have a chance. The rest of them either can't because of a statute of limitations on their trial, or because there are actually 2 cases in which this doesn't apply to indigenous folks. And one is that they have to have actual proof of tribal citizenship or native blood, which is a whole nother can of worms of forcing folks to provide scientific evidence that they are who they are, which is a very European, very colonial, very imperialist way to divide up the world into these little pieces, and rank and order and file and put it away in a box. And then also any crimes that were outside of the boundaries of these 5 nations are non-applicable. So that leaves about 10% of the population that could potentially appeal their trials. So I think the ramifications are more likely to be outside of moving forward in this case rather than retroactively, which is frequently what happens with court cases. However, it's an incredible win for tribal sovereignty. And when I was researching this last night, I actually ran across another, just a couple of days ago, a huge swath of land in the Big Sur area in California. I'm looking it up right now. The Esselen tribe, which is one of California's smallest tribes, were pushed out of their land by Spanish explorers, and they were just awarded almost 1,200 acres in Big Sur. This was literally last week, which is pretty cool. So we're seeing some actual movement towards giving Native people their land back, which is incredible. I when I was researching this, I ran across, I have like 85 tabs up right now. And it's way too much to talk about in one morning, but there's so much here, and there's so much about the history of Indigenous people that we don't know, and the ongoing struggles are really, really profound. And this is a population that was here way before us, and we came in, we destroyed their land. An interesting thing that I was reading about was George Washington's policy towards Native Americans, which was extraordinarily brutal. And in case you have recently watched Hamilton and have this like rosy picture of George Washington in your mind, he very brutally ordered what became known as scorched earth policies. So this was particularly, it started with the Sullivan Clinton campaign in 1799. If you have not heard about this, I highly recommend looking it up. Washington was pretty annoyed with the Iroquois Nation tribes up in what's now New York-ish in the Northeast. And he ordered, it was the Haudenosaunee Nation up there, and he effectively sent a letter that said, we have to destroy, I wonder if I can find it. I bet I can. It was in this book. It was pretty incredible. I could probably Google it faster than I could find it in this book. Oh man, that's another really interesting one to talk about. I might Google it. Washington total destruction. Yeah, okay, so this is from George Washington to Major General John Sullivan, 31st of May, 1779. Sir, the expedition you are appointed to command is to be directed against the hostile tribes of the 6 nations of Indians with their associates and adherents. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. It's pretty incredible. He's going on down a little bit. He said, I would recommend that some post in the center of the Indian country should be occupied with all expedition with a sufficient quantity of provision, whence parties should be detached to lay waste all the settlements around with instructions to do it in the most effectual manner, that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed. So just on the off chance that you had a rosy picture of George Washington, there's some tea for you this morning on the good old GW. Somebody on Twitter said, how do I send a request to effectively to you? You can tweet at me. I'm on Twitter. Anyway, so George Washington ordered this major general to go into Major General? What did I just say? Major General John Sullivan, to go in and just decimate this land. So this is land that has been farmed for generations upon generations upon generations upon generations, and we're just going in and destroying it. And some of this is based on an interesting precedent from I think it was Pope Alexander in the 1400s. He declared that any lands found by Christians that were not inhabited by Christians belonged to the Christians. So any European who was sailing along and bumped into lands where there weren't any Christians could just say, oh, this is mine. So that's effectively what Europeans started doing. There were a lot of lot of kind of crashing things that happened at the same time. Something that I focused a lot of my studies on in college was the late 1800s, early 1900s ethnological exhibitions and world fairs. And that's a whole nother fascinating topic that maybe I'll cover sometime. But we had this Europeans, I say we because I am of European descent. I am super European. And in fact, my direct ancestors have been in this country for many, many years, and we're in that Northeast area. So I wonder what my ancestral folks were doing up there, and having that sense of generational responsibility for any trauma they caused and any pain they inflicted, and working to make a better place now. Anyway, I say we. So European folks started to have this obsession with naming and filing and just scientifically organizing things. A huge thing at the turn of that century was phrenology, which was measuring your skull and measuring folks' like heads to basically figure out why they were inferior. That's recently become a new thing too. There was something, I saw something recently. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, please tell me, because it's not coming right to mind. But there was like a weird resurgence of phrenology recently that is terrifying because it's not scientific at all. There are frequently scientific things that are very non-scientific. But at any rate, so we had this obsession with just like categorizing and shelving and collecting things that didn't belong to us. And there's a whole lot in there of identity and trying to establish this new nation at the expense of so much else. And, you know, there's a lot of time in between 1779, when George Washington is burning fields in New York and marching people out of their lands already, and in the late 1800s, when these ethnological exhibitions were happening. But it's also not that much has changed for the native population. I mean, at the end of the 19th century, we have Wounded Knee in 1890, which is after the Civil War. And, you know, this 1903 Act that says Congress can tell tribes they no longer have land. And we don't have a Citizenship Act until 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act. Fun fact, I didn't know this. Herbert Hoover's vice president, Charles Curtis, was a Native American. He was also the first Native senator. He was elected in 1907. But he was also pointed to as kind of an example of a good Indian who had reformed his savage ways and become assimilated into the European culture. And that goes down another road of the forced boarding schools that started in the early 1900s. Shortly after Wounded Knee, some European folks, European descendants, decided that they literally said, it would just be cheaper if we kidnapped all the Native children and put them in schools and didn't let them speak their language or practice their religion. And it would be cheaper for us to do that than it would be to continue fighting. So that's effectively what we did. We forced hundreds and hundreds of Native children into boarding schools and forbade them from speaking their native languages. And we did effectively destroy completely a lot of cultures this way. The irony is that the government in World War II relied so heavily on the Navajo code talkers, which is a whole nother thing. If you don't know about, I recommend you Google it. Relied so heavily on them to help us win the war, honestly. And so that you have the irony of them speaking their language and being encouraged to embrace their culture in the midst of and right after their children have been taken away and forced to, I think the quote was, kill the Indian, save the man, which is absolutely preposterous. So anyway, there's lots here. There's also, we didn't talk about the forced sterilization of Native American women in the 60s and 70s. I mean, come on, folks. If you're my age, that could have been your mother. Seriously, like it's insane how recent this is. And we have full circle back to land rights. We've got Standing Rock is a great example of the most recent greed over honor example. So my advice is, if you want to buy wild rice, buy it from a native seller up in Wisconsin or Minnesota. There are several. One of them is the Leech Lake tribe, I believe, of Ojibwe Native Americans. And this is a whole nother section. We can talk about agriculture and Monsanto and how heritage seeds are so vital. And you can support these farmers. That's one good thing about the internet age is we can find these people and help support them virtually without needing to be nearby. If you are nearby, you can go buy like 50-pound bags of rice if you want to. I probably won't order a 50-pound bag of rice, but 1 or 5, also, if you've never had true wild rice, you're super missing out because it's really good. I grew up in northwestern Wisconsin, and where I go to write is up in, I try and go there yearly. It's up in Iron River, Wisconsin, which is not far from the Bad River Reservation. And they are one of the tribes that's working on reclaiming land to farm and reclaiming water for their fish and for their rice. So we are all very interconnected, y'all. That's all I got today. That was kind of a lot. I could go on. I highly recommend this book, Recovering the Sacred, Winona LaDuke. That's all. See you next week. Go learn some tribe names.